Hello and welcome back to your Bamboo Chalupa digital marketing podcast. My name is Brett Snyder. I am the president of Knucklepuck in Washington, D.C., and I'm joined by my co-host, Nate Shiver, the author of shiverweb.com.
Hello, hello.
So today on the episode, we're going to bring back one of our most popular guests. When we last spoke to Evan Porter, he was the lead copywriter at a marketing agency in Atlanta. Since then, he's moved on to a full-time position with UpWorthy, where he writes and packages uplifting stories with the expressed goal of helping that content go viral.
Yeah, and we chose this topic and wanted to talk to Evan specifically because content promotion at scale is a theme that we have talked about on Bamboo Chalupa and come back to. It means getting your content seen by millions. That's a scale where you're not going to get 1 to 2 links. You're getting hundreds of thousands of shares, you're getting dozens and hundreds of links, and you're getting into that feedback loop, that flywheel that's going to really build your business wherever you're at.
Yeah, and there are entire businesses that are built on this content model. UpWorthy is obviously a great example of that, and we're excited to have Evan share some of his experiences on the UpWorthy team. But you can also think about BuzzFeed, you think about Viral Nova, at a smaller scale, but with the same aspirations, we can look to ShiverWeb. There are entire businesses that are built on creating compelling content. And there's also organizations that leverage this idea of compelling content in other ways. You can think about Red Bull and GoPro, Virgin and REI, these companies that we've spoken about before on the podcast in terms of really kind of marquee case studies when it comes to content promotion and content scale. And regardless of the size of your organization, whether you're trying to write content for personal or professional growth, there are best practices that anybody can borrow from these major entities to make sure that your investment in content is worthwhile.
All right. Well, Evan, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me back. I had a blast last time, so excited to be here with you guys again.
Yeah, definitely. And like Brett mentioned, when we last talked, you were at marketing agency in Atlanta. You've done a lot of work on your own, on Medium, on wordsbyevanporter.com, and now you're getting to see the side of content at UpWorthy. And I have to start by asking, what's the biggest difference that you've seen going from, a marketing agency content job to sort of now a pure content position where your job is to basically think about how to make these pieces of content go viral?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think in some ways you can think of it like going from agency side to client side. And UpWorthy is a brand and our product is really great stories. And so, my job is really to like it was at the agency, but even more so now, is to really just think about content and think about finding great stories. And what's great about it now is that there's no limitations on where those stories can go. There's fewer brand guidelines. There's less revenue pressure. There's no selling the need for content. That stuff's already been done. So I really just get to sit and scour the web and try to find the best stories that I can and focus on my craft as a writer.
And kind of given the range of projects that you've worked on, how does that mindset shift? You're going from an UpWorthy type scale. We've talked about Medium. We've talked to small business projects. We've talked about your personal. There's a lot of overlap, I would expect, in terms of the process that you have for producing this content. But what are kind of some underlying themes? We talked a little about those best practices we're looking for that can be applied regardless of the type of content you're producing, but to make sure that you can still go out there and produce the best possible content.
Sure. So obviously, working at UpWorthy is by far the biggest scale that I've ever worked on. So even when I was writing my own stuff, on Medium or my own blog, we're talking about hundreds or thousands of views. And now we're talking, much greater volume than that. And working with clients at the agency, they ran the gamut as well. Some of them were hundreds of thousands of views. Some of them, you'd be hard pressed to get anything going with the size of their built-in audience. So, the biggest thing you can probably take away from what it's like to work at such a large scale is how high the stakes are. So when you have hundreds of thousands or millions of people seeing your work, there's a lot at stake. There's a lot of pressure for the content to be good, to be, and there's a lot of kind of fail safes built into UpWorthy's process. There's a standards team that helps us with rigorous fact checking, making sure we can stand behind everything we put out. making sure everything's proofread multiple times, no typos, no grammar mistakes, proper stylistic standards, and all those sorts of things. Because you only get a chance to do it one time. I mean, if you put something out and it's got a mistake and hundreds of thousands of people see it, that's tough to bounce back from. So I think that's probably a good habit for people to get into in terms of thinking about, the content you put out and making sure it's the absolute best that you can create.
And so when you're talking about that, what if there are some folks that maybe don't have the rigorous kind of standards team that you have? Is there anything that you can kind of provide some of our listeners that are a little bit on the smaller scale to say, how do you translate something, or how do you take those principles and apply them to more of a personal or a small business approach?
Yeah, I don't think you need a huge team for it necessarily. It certainly helps, but especially Nate, I think, can understand as a someone who creates a lot of content. Having your own set of standards that you create can be really helpful in terms of, if you're going to link to a source, what do you consider to be an acceptable source for information? When where you're getting your facts, and you're linking back to a place, you want to make sure that that's a legitimate source. Otherwise you're responsible for it if you've called it out. Getting another set of eyes on your content, even if you're just kind of a one-man team, there's got to be someone that you can find to give it a run through, make sure there's no mistakes in it from a grammar or a copy standpoint. And just kind of making sure you're being thorough and you have a set of processes in place, whatever they may be, whatever you have the resources for, to ensure that you're not having to make mistakes and backtrack.
That's really interesting that you mention those checklists and having that kind of templates and processes, even if they're on a small scale, because I think a lot of people peg, Upworthy or even just a lot of the content producers online as, sites that produce content for content's sake. And I think that on the small scale, I know working at the agency, a lot of times this is how CEOs can perceive a content marketing pitch, that, we're just doing content for content's sake. But it sounds like there's a lot of thought and a lot of processes that go on behind the scenes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the things that you really start to understand is that, it's designed to look very easy. And when you look at an Upworthy article or, even something on BuzzFeed or anything like that, it's designed to be very accessible and very friendly. And it's a lot of bolded text, and it's a lot of GIFs, and it's a lot of images, and it's very easy to interact with. And I think that can give people the impression that it's easy to create, but that's not necessarily the case.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think that people will look at something like that and say, oh, I could do that, or this is easy?
Because I think that's kind of built into the experience of it, where, Upworthy and sites like Upworthy are people who really understand the way the web works very well and how people interact with the web. And so, there's a lot of mechanisms behind that, obviously, that I'm sure we'll get into, but, we understand what happens to people at the beginning of an article. Where are we losing people? How can we use different font sizes? How can we use bolded text? How can we use GIFs? How can we use images? Things like that to kind of draw people down the page and keep them immersed in the story. And if you're not familiar with the behind the scenes stuff, it may not appear or you may not realize what's kind of happening, but it just becomes a very easy, fluid experience. And I'm not sure. I think the perception can be that, this was easy to put together.
No, I think it's, at least for me, when I approach writing, I think since everyone can, well, not everyone, but since most people can write in some form or fashion, people are writing emails, they're writing letters, they're writing social media posts, they think that they know writing. And so when they see something that is written about something that they know, they think, oh, they know this, or I know about this, I know about this recipe, I know about this town, I know about the results in this quiz, I know how to write, therefore I know how to put these two things together and write about something I know, hence post. But like you said, it seems like there is not necessarily a magic sauce, but a lot of these things going on behind the scenes. And so what I'm curious to know is, especially as you've transitioned from marketing agency and then also had your personal successes, Medium and Words by Evan Porter, are there things that you have brought along, best practices that you've seen work on your last Medium post that you also try to translate to your Upworthy posts that consistently do well, no matter where you're publishing it.
Oh, definitely. And this is kind of funny because I consider myself to be a writer, and I come from writing. Some of my stuff has been long form type of things and essays, and for a very, very long time I fought this notion of, well, you need you need bold, and you need images, and you need lists. I fought this notion for a long time, and I always thought, like, well, if you're a great writer, you should just be able to write long form that's really great. And you can, and you definitely can. But I think your life is going to get a lot easier if you kind of give in to some of these best practices that you know to be true, like using odd numbers in a list, breaking up your text with images, using other visual elements, making things interactive. You know these things are true, and as soon as you start to really implement them in your own work, you're going to see the payoff.
I think what's interesting about that is you know them to be true because as a writer or as a producer of content, you are simultaneously a consumer of content. So you have to be able to look at it to say, all right, well, I am also my own audience. You start to say it, and I think it kind of ties back to go back before, but the differences here, where you will almost look at how some people who have a cell phone camera is not the same as being a photographer. Kind of to Nate's point that you start to have these individual pieces in there. And so if we start to think about these kind of subtleties, these nuanced things that you don't even realize as you're reading it, you're almost more of an informed consumer of the content, which is why I think these best practices come very naturally to you, and it's much more difficult for people who aren't full-time writers to be able to think about, I guess it makes sense to put an image in there. You can talk about best practice in terms of how far across the page does it go. I remember when I was in high school, my civics teacher taught us that we had to take all of our notes in a 2-column format on our notebooks there, because people start to lose interest once you go more than halfway across the page. And these are things that you just don't even really realize as you're reading them until somebody points that out to you. But it makes perfect sense. It's kind of a facepalm moment when you realize these best practices that you didn't even really consciously understand or consciously, recognize as you were reading them become something that influences your own writing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I fought the concept of lists for so long, and I thought, like, I don't want to write a list. I don't want to do a listicle.
I was wondering if you would drop listicle in there.
Yeah, listicle. Yeah, absolutely. And as a writer, is a listicle going to be my magnum opus? No, but can it accomplish what I need it to accomplish in terms of, for me, getting a lot of page views and getting a lot of people excited about an idea? Yes. If I'm a business owner, can it drive traffic to my website and get people, excited about what I have to say? Definitely.
That's interesting. Especially when you start talking about the structure and the headlines and some of the specifics about these best practices. So let's kind of go off in that direction and talk specifically about headlines and structure. And you had mentioned headlines earlier. So let's talk about those first. What's the deal with headlines? And can you tell us some of the behind the scenes Upworthy about how you guys work with headlines?
So, Upworthy is famous for its headlines, and probably for the wrong reasons. At least that's the perception. Headlines are hugely important. I don't think you need to spend too much time convincing people of that. They're, in most cases, they're one of, if not the first thing that people see in terms of your content, and it determines whether they want to click in or not. And so there's a lot of weight on the headline. And so Upworthy is kind of famous for what people have, called clickbait, right? So it's the, oh, you won't believe what happened next type of headline, where something in you is just like, I have to click this. But if you're paying attention and you go and kind of look around Upworthy today, you're not going to see nearly as much of that. You're going to see it way dialed back. Even though a lot of imitators and other kind of publishers are still doing that. And that's because it's not a good long-term strategy. The clickbait, it's been kind of denounced by Facebook. And kind of the definition of clickbait is, once you click, you're disappointed by what you see in the article, right? So you click in and you're like, oh, this isn't as cool as I thought. Or
I think that's interesting because that's not the original, really, at least from my perspective, is not the original definition of clickbait. you're just you're trying to encourage people to click through. You're trying to entice them to click. Now that there's now kind of an established connotation that it's deceiving or that it's negative, but it's kind of most basic form. I would argue that clickbait is just an engaging title. It's your first impression. I think that if we gave it another name, maybe people would, drop the connotation. But I think that's really, and that's why we wanted to talk about headlines here, because it's obviously something that is going to influence how people click through. But when we talk about this idea of clickbait, that's almost the same argument as content for content's sake. The title can't just be for the sake of clicks. It needs to actually be an introduction to that content, which is why it's just such a fascinating part of the content planning process.
Oh yeah, and I totally agree with you. I mean, I think the line between clickbait and good headlines is not a thick black line. I think it's very gray, very fuzzy. Because yeah, we're not writing news articles. We don't want the headline to give away everything and give people no reason to click. In fact, I've seen some of my own stories where, we gave away a little too much, and a lot of people maybe liked the content, maybe a lot of people shared it, but they didn't actually click in to read it because they got everything they needed from the headline. And so that's what you don't want to happen. But what you also don't want is to have people clicking in because they want one very specific piece of information, or because you've sort of enticed them and they have really no idea what to expect, and they just kind of want to pique their curiosity, but they're not actually interested in what the content's going to hold.
So that's the balance you have to strike, really. You have to strike that balance between engaging but not revealing, but revealing still enough to be able to get people engaged. It's just kind of that circular argument there. And I think that's just the balance, and because headlines are so subjective. One person's clickbait is another person's viral headline, but we start to talk about, these nuances and these subtleties and that thick gray overlapping line that you referred to, in terms of what your title is actually able to accomplish.
So what's the process that you go through to try to find the headline that's going to hit that sweet spot? Because I know with the challenge with content and launching content on the scale that Upworthy is launching, like you said, if you put it out in the world and it's wrong, it's almost like the content is almost wasted. And so it seems like there would be a lot of pressure to get it right on the front end. And so how do you balance that? I mean, are there testing mechanisms? Do you go through editorial? Do you have, do you make a long list of multiple headlines? Could you kind of talk about that process a bit?
Yeah, definitely. And Upworthy does quite a bit of testing on our content before it goes out. And that's one of the benefits of having as much traffic as Upworthy does. You can spare a couple thousand impressions here and there to kind of dip your toes in the water, so to speak, with a piece of content and see, okay, which headline is going to work, which thumbnail is going to work, which combination of headline and thumbnail is going to work the best. And it doesn't tell you everything, but it gives you a pretty good idea of what you're getting into before you commit to a final version of a piece of content.
And so that's the kind of thing where you can do a temporary Facebook promoted post and test out a couple variations, and then whichever one is performing the best, that's what you make the organic post. Is that kind of how?
Yeah, sort of. I can't go into too many specifics.
No, yeah. But just best practices.
Yeah, but essentially that's kind of what it is. It lives on Upworthy's website, so it doesn't live on Facebook. You serve different kind of packages to different people on the site, and kind of see, you're able to measure the engagement from there in terms of which ones are clicking, which ones are sharing, and things like that before you finalize anything.
So I have one last kind of question, almost process tactically with regards to these headlines. I've talked to a number of different writers, and everybody seems to have their own little process for this. But for you personally, when do you write your headlines? Do you write them before you start? Do you write them as it's, you're going through? How do you write your headlines, or at least go through the physical process of producing it?
I like to have a working title before I start, or kind of as I'm beginning the piece. Just kind of, a first blush pass at what I think the headline might look like. And then as I write it and it comes together, you're free to change that. And then, at testing, you come up with multiple variations and see what does the best. But I will say that if you're having trouble with a piece and you're having trouble getting the angle right or finding the right frame, it can help to write headlines before. And I think that's a perfectly viable process that can really help you in the process. But it really depends on what you're more comfortable with. I'm kind of more of a working title guy, but I know other writers who like to do all their headline work before.
How does that work for your process, Nate?
Mine is going to be a little bit different just because so much of my content is evergreen and organic traffic focused. But usually at the beginning of writing the piece, when I'm writing the outline, I'll write out 5 to 10 variations, and those will just kind of sit at the top of my document until I finish writing. And then once I have the full document written, I'll go back and just kind of X out the ones that don't fit the post, or ones that I just have not taken to my liking, and then I'll end up with one basically by the process of elimination.
Yeah, and that's interesting, Nate, because I wanted to bring this up with you too, because I know a lot of your work is keyword based, and it's very specific keyword themes you're trying to target. I think one tip I can give for kind of writing the opposite of that, right, is like more social type, trending headlines, is to play around with different, starkly different keywords. I think trying different headline formats and not just rearranging the same words over and over again, but, instead of, maybe instead of global warming, try climate change, try climate disruption, and try to, explore what different connotations different, sometimes we call them trigger words, have. And, if you're just rearranging all the same words in a headline, I don't think you're really going to get a solid variation. But if you really try starkly different options, that's going to lead you to the best one.
Yeah, I love the concept of trigger words. And that's actually, I do work with one of my clients who he has a big following for his website. And so he's trying to get this mix of increasing organic traffic and social traffic. And so we have a lot of this back and forth between, writing a title that's basically purely setting and providing user expectations, which is usually gold for SEO. People are searching for this. They see a headline. Oh, that matches perfectly with what I want. They click through, versus the social. And he loves basically taking that organic focus title and throwing in one trigger word, like something like wacky or disrupting, or, just something that's kind of off the wall. And so far that seems to be something that's working fairly well. And I had never heard that concept of trigger words until he had mentioned it. And it's interesting that you bring it up too.
It's an interesting application when you talk about kind of SEO, because we get so focused on this keyword has the most volume. This keyword is what we're targeting. We wrote this to rank for this keyword. And I think that puts us, it's to a detriment of the content and the overall quality of the content if we try to put everything into that, that realm, especially kind of with the advent of semantic over the past 2 or 3 years, with semantic search and Hummingbird and, Google's much more kind of nuanced understanding of language. The importance of the highest volume keyword, I think, is declining in terms of what is the index of keywords that you're able to speak to. What are some of these different adjectives or variations that now, when viewed as, we can talk about co-occurring, we can go into any of these kind of scientific algorithm-based kind of approaches, but this idea of trying to find your trigger word, trying to find the content that's engaging and what is going to be the most valuable keyword phrase to engage with that audience, maybe a keyword that has a third or a quarter or an eighth of the volume is much more appealing to people willing to link to it. So you kind of have this, it's not a perfect linear approach to even SEO keyword research anymore from content, which is my background. And I know a lot of Nate as well, but for me, looking at things where when we produce content, it's got SEO goals to it, really sometimes exclusively to a fault. And we have to try to look at what are these user engagement elements that need to be incorporated for that content to perform the way that we know it can perform.
Awesome. Well, let's move into beyond the tactics of structure and headlines into, the different types of content and how you time the content. Because I know this is going to determine not only what you write about, but also where you promote. And so Evan, I know Upworthy does a lot with Facebook, but you yourself have had a lot of experience, everything from LinkedIn to organic to Facebook and everything else. In your current job, how do you plan content and how do you think through the distribution and promotion while you're writing it?
Yeah, it's a good question. And in some ways, I'm not tasked with thinking about a ton of that. So my job is to really find the best stories at the moment, and a lot of it, frankly, isn't planned super far ahead. At least on my level at the company, we're finding things that are trending, things that are new, things that are that people are talking about, and that's kind of where a lot of our writing lives. But there's also, plenty of examples where you're digging up an old story that's happened that got a lot of attention, and maybe it's kind of cooled off. But we can bring it to our audience in a new and fresh way. And so I think there's kind of a balance of both of those things. So, and when I talk about trending content, I mean, things that are currently getting shared on social, and even things that are in Facebook's literal trending box or Twitter's trending box.
So I think the Facebook trending box is going back to those kind of headlines that people, that's really pretty interesting to me in terms of those headlines that people don't even click through. I know that Facebook recently changed. They won't show you the images anymore. I know I was somebody who I just want to see the picture, do that, and I wasn't clicking through. So then it comes into kind of full circle in terms of how these elements play together, from where you're going to promote it, from the titles, and from the, kind of the body of that content. And so one of the questions I know that, we struggle with in terms of being able to refine our process is anticipating trends and being able to recognize what people are looking for in the time that they're looking for it, and then how we can actually kind of harness those trends to be able to produce content that aligns with what people are looking for. Can you talk us through a little bit of your process for being able to anticipate or identify these emerging trends and then capitalize on them?
Yeah, well, it's a really interesting time to be kind of a web writer or a journalist, because it kind of seems like the workflow is some sort of story will break in, local media or even just straight on social media, and then it'll start to get picked up by bigger and bigger outlets and sort of repackaged, and people will dive deeper into it. And so there's a lot of tools you can use to kind of monitor stories that are picking up steam, getting social shares, generating conversation. BuzzSumo is one that I think you guys have talked about before. That is one I really like. Monitoring Reddit, kind of seeing what's at the top, what's rising to the top. Even just looking at the literal trending sections of Twitter, and even Facebook has a trending section about stories that are hot right now on Facebook.
No, yeah, I think that's real. I know for the trending stories on Facebook and even rising trends, I mean, what's interesting from a consumer perspective is those are both trending topics and rising trends. Because as more people, a certain number of people, it has to hit a critical mass before it's going to show up in your Twitter trending or your Facebook trended searches. But it's also on the upswing when it first shows up. Because you start to get all right, it's reached that critical mass for being able to show up in these trending searches, but then what is the ceiling? Where do you go from there? And I think being able to try to extract those trends and capture them in real time is a real challenge for writers, and I'm be interested if there's anything in terms of actually capturing the rising trends, or how do you ride that wave once you see something is starting to pop up in Reddit or in Twitter, Facebook, any of these other social networks or other platforms. How do you capture that wave and then ride it into, since the time it's going to take to produce content. You can't turn your type of content around in 15 minutes. So how do you take advantage of that to be able to produce something that capitalizes on trends, but still is able to do it in a way that's agile and efficient?
Yeah, it has to be built into your workflow. I mean, if you're used to doing evergreen type content, and all of a sudden you want to jump on a trending piece, it's going to be tough to adapt your workflow to be that fast. Like you said, you can't do it in 15 minutes. You can't put together a good piece of content that fast. But you can maybe do it in an hour or two if you've got the pieces in place to make that happen. And so it's a combination of speed and anticipation too. Sometimes things are going to trend, right? If you're watching the news and you're if you're plugged into, for us it's kind of general pop culture or news, but it might be for a client more of an industry niche type of thing. If you're plugged in and there's going to be a big announcement, people are going to be talking about it. You can anticipate better that way. Like for us, we know that, anytime John Oliver does a segment, it's going to be trending, right?
Right.
Anytime Obama speaks, people are going to be talking about it. Things like that. You can kind of anticipate those big moments. And I think that works on a smaller scale too. If there's a big announcement in your field, if there's a big development that is coming, then you can maybe be ahead of the trend that way.
And I think that speaks to, and we've talked about this idea of identifying your key influencers and trying to, to kind of Barnacle on. We've used Barnacle SEO in a couple of different applications, but to have a Barnacle approach to your trends, know who your trendsetters are, and then follow them. You may not necessarily get in front of those trend centers, but you'll be drafting immediately behind them and be prepared so that you can get to your point, Evan, about your workflow. You can do all of the, foundational work in advance of actually knowing what the content topic or the specifics is going to be. So that way you've already got a head start on the other folks that are just hearing about it when they watched Last Week Tonight.
Yeah. And I think there's a bit of a curatorial mindset that can be really helpful. You don't have to, not everything that you do has to be 100% original. I mean, you can react to things that are happening. You can repackage and add your own, fresh spin on something that's happened. You can tell stories that exist that have already, been told, and just bring them to your audience in a fun way. And that can be a much easier lift on you, but can still have a lot of great success that way.
Interesting. You mentioned, taking content that's known in one audience and repurposing it for yours. As the years go on, we're starting to have more and more years where, we have we have trends from 2014, 2013, 2012 that were written about in this way. So what's your approach, and kind of what's Upworthy's approach to republishing, repurposing and jumping on trends that have happened in the past that are probably going to happen in the future? I think the main case in point would be like the pumpkin spice. Every year, seems like for the past 3 years, that's kind of a trend that we know is coming. And are there opportunities that you see, for your clients or, small businesses to be able to use that?
Yeah, well, I think it comes down to, I would say, knowing your brand and your brand voice. Like we know what Upworthy's voice is, right? We know our mission, is better stories for a better world. We know what our content looks like. And so when there is a trend that we can anticipate, or some kind of story that maybe already exists, but we think there's an opportunity to repackage it, we know that our job is going to be to A, make it really accessible, and B, highlight why it's important, why it matters. And so, if you're maybe a smaller brand or a smaller business or some other kind of publisher, you're going to have your own kind of unique way of talking about topics. And I think you gotta not have as much pressure on yourself to have everything be 100% new and original. I mean, if there's a way for you to add value to something in your own unique way that only and your audience likes, then that's perfectly fine, and that's something that you should be doing.
And that's actually just the idea of being able to, the pumpkin spice. It's just a really cool concept that Aaron Levy, who's another one of the former guests that we've had on the show, has talked about doing PPC audiences and cookie audiences that go back 12, 18 months. So that when you start to know, all right, now you have a sense of kind of keyword focus from a paid media perspective, just to kind of apply some of these similar ideas from a paid media perspective to be able to have informed decisions. And I think all of that together, it's just a product of using the information that's available to you and really broadening your understanding of what is available to you really means. You may have to set the framework in place to capture that, but if you're able to do that in a way that can scale across seasons, across years, that's going to give you a way to be able to stay in front of those trends.
I love it. Well, let's talk about distribution and both distribution channels, but then also the actual mechanics of promotion. So, Evan, you mentioned that a lot of your work focuses on Facebook right now, and that you also have a team who, they do a lot of the mechanics of the promotion, but you've also done a lot of things on, Medium, on Dig. Are there any best practices or lessons that you've seen for how different channels work in different ways? How content interacts from one platform to another, and how do you specialize content to do well on one particular platform and still do well on another?
Sure. So a lot of what we do is on Facebook right now. I mean, Upworthy's active on Twitter and on Tumblr and Instagram. But Facebook is really such an interesting beast, and it's so powerful. I mean, Upworthy has almost 8 million fans, I think, on Facebook, and so the potential is for something that does really well to reach even more people beyond that, which is, I think, what's very unique to Facebook. And so it's really kind of incredible watching that in action, and that's why so many people go to Facebook to promote their content. But Twitter can be a great place too. So can Tumblr, so can Instagram. And it's tough to come up with the best practices that apply to all of them. Other than really just understanding the channels as best you can.
I mean, it's almost like asking you to become a generalized specialist. These are at odds with one another. To find content that appeals to these platforms, but then also is applicable across platforms, it's kind of at odds with itself.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I mean, they're all so different, right? I mean, like Tumblr is kind of this manic, high energy place, and what you can do there is that sometimes what we do is we strip out the GIFs from our articles and put them in there. And there's a lot of movement and a lot of energy, on Tumblr. Instagram, is more like these static images. I mean, you can do video on Instagram, but we'll do like more graphical work, more animation or quote graphic type of things, and Twitter, we sometimes do Twitter chats or we try to interact there. They're all so different, and it's really that's really a challenge for, I think, the modern publisher.
So I mean, is the key to kind of pick one source and really figure out what works there, and then figure out how to repurpose it, later onto these different platforms. Say, oh, well, I have GIFs, I could, parlay that into Tumblr channel and take that same approach.
Yeah, I think with, for us, like we have a social media team that can do this, and not everyone's going to have the resources to figure out how to own all channels, and so I know you guys have echoed the sentiment a million times, but where is your audience? And I know there's a lot of industries, and I experienced this on the agency side, where the audience is not on Facebook, and Twitter is maybe more the place, or LinkedIn is more of the place. So trying to be everywhere and trying to always have a plan to get your content on every platform is, I think, going to be a lot more difficult for, a brand publisher.
So would your recommendation then be to pick one and stick with that? Or are you more of the, at least do a decent job across channels? Or would you rather do, focus all your efforts onto that one primary channel?
Yeah, I think you can have one primary and maybe a secondary, or kind of a tertiary one. I don't know if there's necessarily harm in being on a platform and being average at it, but I think there should definitely be one that you feel really good that's your primary distribution platform.
So we're on this topic of kind of promotional outlets, and when we talk about, you've got your Facebooks, your Twitters, the ones that everyone's kind of familiar with and everyone's doing. But what's the best promotional outlet that you've found that no one's really talking about?
Yeah, I mean, it's not new, it's not sexy, but I think people continue to sleep on email. People are on their email every day. The email newsletter continues to be kind of a forgotten relic. It's kind of like the standard, whatever the RSS reader pulls in or whatever it might be. We're sending blog posts word for word. UpWorthy is, and I can't go into too much detail, obviously, but we're in the middle of redesigning our newsletter, relaunching it to kind of add some more value and get people more engaged with it. And because the list is big, and there's a huge opportunity there. So even a big publisher like UpWorthy wants to leverage, an email list.
You talk about where your audience is, promote where your audience is. I mean, this is about as direct of a line to your audience as you got, when you come to your email list. The idea of email is really, we've talked about this idea of dark social, where how are you passing things along, where people are just sending it or IMing it to somebody. These are personal recommendations that are coming through. And if you can leverage that email list, you're now being able to achieve an endorsement if somebody sends it in their own email or from an opt-in email list that really can have a pretty substantial impact for you. So kind of sticking to this idea of promotion, we come at it, and I know me in particular, I kind of focus a lot on what is the actual PR, the outreach, the marketing perspective for it. But your promotion is also influenced by the structure of the content. Like the content itself has a real heavy influence on the type of promotion that you're going to do. So talk to us a little bit about how the structure of your content may dictate, the promotional strategy that you use for it.
Yeah, that's a great point. There's so many factors that go into it. And in terms of, I think we can agree that there's some general, best practices to making something shareable, or to, telling a great story and having something that people enjoy. And one of the things that's a challenge is, as we've seen on Facebook, I think we all know this right by now, but if you have 8 million fans, it doesn't mean that when you publish something, it's going to go to all 8 million, right? So Facebook is looking at a lot of different things, including, click-through rate and likes and shares, but also they're looking at things that are on the page in terms of, are people, kind of clicking right back to Facebook after they click on your content? Is there a high quick exit rate there? So that's why you need to have your content structured in a way that's designed to keep people engaged and keep them drawn to the bottom of the page, so that they want to share and they want to stay engaged with it.
It's kind of presenting a consistent experience from that very first click to know that you're kind of aligning with the expectations of the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of again, there's so many factors. Bad user experience, and some of this falls on the writer too. And it's not just the promotion team. It's not just the, design development team. But, if you're writing an article, or, do you have 10 GIFs in there that are 5 megabytes each, and it's going to load really slow on mobile, and, people are going to hate that and they're going to leave, and that's the kind of thing that maybe you don't think about, but that affects how effective your promotion is, just by the way you're putting the content together.
I think what's really interesting about that is you can take everything that you just said about providing having successful content and apply that to SEO best practices. It's where we see kind of this mishmash of what online marketing really is anymore, because content is a form of marketing. So is SEO. That optimal user experience, load time, being, present on mobile, and the experience on different devices. I could take that exact same soundbite and put it out as an SEO recommendation, which really kind of comes to the underlying factor here, where we have to be focused on that user engagement. It is all about the user at the end of it. If you're not providing an experience that aligns with their expectations, your strategy is going to fail, whether that's a content strategy, whether that's an SEO strategy, or some other, marketing or, engagement approach. You have to understand what the end user and anticipate the wants and needs of that end user, so that you can produce something that aligns with them.
Yeah, I think it's very similar to creating a piece of successful evergreen content. Creating social content. It's a lot of the same best practices. And that's something I didn't necessarily know until recently, is that when we post something on Facebook, you can watch Google Analytics in real time, and it's pretty spectacular to watch it. It happens very, very quickly, whether people are clicking and staying and then liking and sharing versus not. You can see a piece just balloon into the stratosphere, or you can see it get completely buried, and it happens very, very quickly. And more often than not, it has to do with, not so much promotion tactics as it is, how good is the content and how is it structured.
Interesting. And is that something that, it's fairly straightforward to pinpoint, what's happening, on the page that's preventing, sharing, or is creating a lot of bounce rates based on device or whatnot?
Sometimes you can pinpoint it, and that's kind of why our testing system is so helpful. We kind of know generally what to expect when we promote a piece in terms of how clicky it's going to be, how sharey it's going to be. But you can't predict everything, and sometimes unexpected things happen, and then you have to go back and kind of do a post-mortem and say, okay, we thought this piece was going to do a little bit better. Why weren't people sharing it, or why was there a negative reaction to this, and try to learn what you can.
What does that post-mortem process look like for you?
Well, it's a lot of, this is kind of where data meets editorial instinct. You look at the data that you have available and say, whether it's maybe it didn't click as well as you thought, or maybe it didn't share as well as you thought. And then, there's, no formula you can plug it into that's going to tell you exactly what went wrong, but you can take educated guesses. You can say, well, maybe this didn't hit the right emotional tone here for people to share. Maybe it didn't leave people feeling inspired or happy. Maybe it was kind of a bummer and they didn't want to share it. Or, maybe we could have rephrased this headline a bit because one of these words was generating a bad reaction from people. And so you kind of cull all the resources you have with your editorial instinct and just kind of, make your best educated guess, and you try to do better the next time. And that's the business we're in. It's constant content, right? There's always another thing to be written. You can take these lessons and move forward.
All right, Evan, we really appreciate you taking the time to kind of share your expertise. We always love having you on the show. Is there anything else, any kind of final thoughts, advice, tips for some of our listeners in terms of, producing content at scale, and more important, producing meaningful content at scale?
So yeah, I would encourage people, whether you're at a brand publisher, a small business, large business, is really put in some time and effort to finding great human-driven stories, and beware of clickbait. Clickbait comes in many different forms. It can be the headline, it can be the image. You don't want to be making promises you can't deliver on. Just really make sure you're giving a great experience for the user in your content, and I think you're going to be fine.
Well, that is a great way to wrap up. Evan, thank you so much for coming on the show again. Where can people get in contact with you, follow up with you? Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at ESPorter or on Facebook, facebook.com/words by Evan Porter.
All right. Well, again, thank you so much for coming on the show, and everyone go check out Evan's Twitter and Facebook pages. And you can find previous episodes of Bamboo Chalupa, links to all the things that we mentioned, and our contact information at bamboochalupa.com. If you don't want to miss another episode, go subscribe to the podcast in iTunes or your favorite podcast app, and leave a comment and rating while you're there. We learn a lot from your feedback, and your ratings helps others to discover the show. So for Brett Snyder, I'm Nate Shiver. Thank you for listening.